Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure welcoming Mr. Jon Pahl, Professor Jon Pahl, for a session on dialogue, advocacy, collective nonviolent action, from dialogue to peace, growing in the life and work of Fethullah Gulen. Professor Jon Pahl is the Peter Paul and Elizabeth Hagan Professor in the History of Christianity at the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. He is a historian of American religions and the history of Christianity, a public theologian, and an award-winning teacher, musician, and community activist. Paul is the author or editor of 6 books, including Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, and Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. You're welcome, Professor Paul. You have up to 2 hours for this session, and you're welcome to conduct it however you like to. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Behzad. And nice to meet each of you. I would love it if we were all in a room together where I could have each of you go around and say your name and a little bit about who you are and what you're working on, what your passion is. But we are living in the Zoom world these days, and so we will proceed accordingly. I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little more, a little less. I haven't done exactly this version of this talk before, so I'm making it up as I'm going along. And then I will value, feedback, discussion, dialogue with you. Your questions for the second half of our time together. But I have put in the chat an invitation to ask questions during my talk as well, to interrupt me, in other words, in a polite way. If there's something that is particularly pressing, urgent that you want to ask, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I will probably take some time and respond to it, depending on the question. Don't take it personally. If I don't answer it immediately, we can always come back to it during the discussion period. So I'm very pleased to be with you to talk about dialogue, advocacy, collective nonviolent action, peace growing in the life of Fethullah Gulen and the global Hizmet movement. I'm going to start with a quote from a 14th century Roman Catholic nun who lived in England. Her name is Julian of Norwich, and she once said, the way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain, but to lead a life of love and laughter. Now, according to Sigmund Freud, laughter is suppressed anger, but I think Freud is wrong on this. Freud's right on a lot of other things, but on this, I think Freud is wrong. And so I'm going to invite us to try at least to laugh together, because I believe laughter is an expression of solidarity, a participation in collective joy. And so I need someone's help on this, an individual, somebody who knows how knock-knock jokes work. Is there somebody, can you raise your hand if you know how a knock-knock joke goes? Nadia, okay, can you help me out? Can you turn your microphone on? All right, great. So I have 3 really terrible knock-knock jokes to start with here. All right, and Nadia, you're ready to roll? Okay, knock-knock.
Who's there?
Ach.
Ach who?
Bless you, my friend. Terrible, right? Yeah, that's the first one. Second joke. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
Tank.
Tank who?
You're welcome. I know, just bad. All right, and the last one, I promise, this will be it for my joke telling for the day. Right, knock knock.
Who's there?
Olive.
Olive who?
I love you too. All right. So, and that's what's called a transition. Thank you very much, Nadia. I appreciate that. Because love, according to Fethullah Gulen, is the most essential element of every being. Love is the most radiant light. Love is the greatest power, able to resist and overcome all else. So Fethullah Gulen is very much in the spirit of Rumi, the famous Persian poet, who in his poem, I Belong to the Beloved, said this: not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist, am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam or Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the Beloved, have seen the two worlds as one, and that one call to and know, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath, breathing, human being. So that's Rumi, I belong to the Beloved, as translated by Coleman Barks. Following in the sense of belonging to the Beloved, Fethullah Gulen's approach to dialogue focuses, first of all, on the concept of hoşgörü, which is a Turkish word usually translated as tolerance, but that's a really poor translation of what hoşgörü means, because more accurately, hoşgörü, as understood in Fethullah Gulen's thought and in the global Hizmet movement, means interreligious engagement in what I call principled pluralism. Principled pluralism. So Gulen's hoşgörü, that is this principle of tolerance at the core of his practice of dialogue, brought him into community, into relationship with Jews, Christians, atheists, and other Muslims in efforts to develop new coalitions. And at various points in my talk, I'm going to read to you from my book, I Lost the Dust Jacket, Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet. So bear with me as I find my way to the proper page. This is, I don't know if you have copies of the biography or not. It's okay if you don't, but this is on page 286. And it's a talk that Gulen wrote for the Parliament of the World's Religions in Cape Town, South Africa in December of 1999. And here's what he says. Our tolerance, that's that Turkish word hoşgörü, our tolerance should be so broad that we can close our eyes to others' faults, show respect for different ideas, and forgive everything that is forgivable. Even when our inalienable rights are violated, we should respect human values and try to establish justice. He goes on. Tolerance, hoşgörü, which we sometimes use in place of respect and mercy, generosity and forbearance, is the most essential element of moral systems. It is also a very important source of spiritual discipline and a celestial virtue of perfected men and women. Under the lens of tolerance, believers' merits attain a new depth and extend to infinity. Mistakes and faults shrink into insignificance. Actually, the treatment of the one who is beyond time and space always passes through the prism of hoşgörü, and we wait for it to embrace us and all creation. So that's dialogue. Hoşgörü, tolerance, principled pluralism. Beyond dialogue, Gulen advocated for a non-binary world, a world where conventional dualisms are overcome. Any dualism or us versus them dichotomy is false for Gulen, is false to the God, to the beloved who created everything, all of us. One of the most robust ways in which Gulen put his advocacy into practice is through anti-sexism and anti-racism work, calling for justice on behalf of women and justice for Africans and other historically oppressed groups, including in Turkey, the Kurds. Gulen here understood himself to be following in the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who overcame Arab, non-Arab tribal dualism and who fostered a culture of altruism. So to page 267 in the book, Gulen writes, I believe that sincerity and mutual respect are critical, as well as characteristic expressed in the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, wishing for others what we wish for ourselves and avoiding deeds that we wouldn't like to have happen to ourselves, the golden rule. Moreover, choosing other people over ourselves, a significant feature of the locals of Medina that is also praised in the Quran, will help us overcome hatred. Turkish and Kurdish civil society organizations, so he's writing here about Turkey and the Kurds. Turkish and Kurdish civil society organizations can greatly contribute to peace by providing the grounds for the aforementioned values and facilitating people embracing them. On such grounds, people can come together and form a kind of unity that will last. This is possible, and efforts must be channeled in this direction. So, second topic, this culture of altruism and emphasis on non-binary living, that is beyond dualisms, and advocacy for those who are marginalized, putting others before oneself. Finally, beyond dialogue and advocacy, Gulen inspired people to take collective nonviolent action in Hizmet, service to humanity, hence the name of the global movement inspired by him, the Hizmet, service movement. Gulen did so through a principle of Müsbet Hareket, which means positive action. Even more critically, positive action that does not react to evil. All right, so taking us back to Julian of Norwich, the way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain, but to lead a life of love and laughter. Positive action. This positive action and nonviolent collective action takes many forms, notably for Gulen through the 5 pillars of Islam: confession, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, and sharing of material resources. But it's also manifest in a way of relating to each other, a way of communicating with each other, a way of doing business, following the principle of istishara, mutual consultation in the forging of social enterprises. The businesses that grew up then around Gulen, developed by individuals inspired by him, were of many kinds, but they shared a goal to serve the common good and to grow peace. Page 294 in the book, Gulen on istishara, with a little bit of my own prose thrown in. The learning in a consultation could go 2 ways. And so I look forward to learning from you as our conversation continues, as we consult about dialogue, advocacy, and collective nonviolent action. Gulen did not only give direction to people's activities through istishara, he also could become aware of a potential new direction through the activities of those with whom he met. Exactly what Gulen meant by consultation, this istishara, he made clear in a 1994 essay. Istishara was not an option for Muslims, according to Gulen. It was a requirement, and it was as important as prayer. And here's what he says. For the Muslims of today, consultation is a vital attribute and an essential rule, just as it was for the first Muslims. According to the Quran, consultation is the clearest sign of a believing community and the most important characteristic of a congregation who have given their hearts to Islam. The importance of consultation is mentioned in the Quran to the same degree as salat, the prescribed prayers. Given this importance, Gulen goes on, the most intelligent person is the one who most appreciates and respects mutual consultation and deliberation, and who benefits most from the ideas of others. Those who are content with their own ideas and their plans and deeds, or who even insist or force others to accept their ideas, not only miss a very important dynamic, but also face disagreement, hostility, and hatred from the people with whom they are associated, end quote. Pragmatic criteria like avoiding hatred help keep istishara from the realm of idealist fantasy. I go on. Consultation was required in any and every activity. Quote from Gulen, ventures and enterprises embarked on without sufficient prior consultation do not go far. To consultation belongs the most important mission and duty of resolving affairs concerning the individual and the community, to people in the state, science and knowledge, and economics and sociology, end quote. After all, if the prophet had engaged in consultation, who could not? Another quote from Gulen, even if the head of state or the leader is confirmed by God and nurtured by revelation and inspiration, he or she is under obligation to conduct affairs by consultation, end quote. Not only a requirement, consultation proved itself in practice. One more long quote from Gulen. Consultation within its remit promises some effects and also follows some rules which lead to positive outcomes. In this regard, we may mention 1, an increase in the level of thought and intervention in society. 2, reminding society of its own importance by taking its views on all events. 3, by leading it to produce alternative ideas. 4, by ensuring that the people remain aware of the necessity for questioning and calling to account the administrators whenever the situation requires them to do so. And 5, by preventing irresponsible behaviors of rulers by limiting their executive power, end quote. So these were not merely pious platitudes, this commitment to istishara, mutual consultation. It worked. And it led to this rapidly growing global movement called Hizmet. It's really, as a historian of religion, it's a remarkable thing to have been able to study and realize how this one individual's commitment to Islam, this principled practice of Islam, that is, I belong to the beloved, then led to this dynamic global movement focused on education, interreligious dialogue, and social enterprise. So that's my introduction. I'll say a few more words today about Hoshgorou, Gulen's approach to dialogue, about his advocacy for marginalized groups following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That's the second section. And third, his principle of mushpet harakat, positive action, taking shape in social enterprises through istishara, mutual consultation, to serve the common good. Throughout, woven into his entire life, at the very foundation, is this ideal, again, of belonging to the beloved, and then of acting in a way that is pleasing to God. Gulen once wrote, either tell about the beloved or hush. Okay, so 3 sections then to my talk in the remaining time that we have before we go to Q&A and dialogue. First section is entitled The Global Context. Anti-democratic democracies built around authoritarian nationalist religions with strong men leading, seeing dialogue as their greatest threat. So I want to set Gulen's work on dialogue in the context of our current global situation. I'm going to mention the names of a few political leaders that I trust you'll be familiar with as sort of examples of this situation, the problems we face with these anti-democratic democracies built around authoritarian nationalist religions. Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, Tayyip Erdogan, Narendra Modi. These leaders employ religions to prop up nationalist and racist power through violence, through state-sponsored and criminal violence. This is a perversion of religion to serve the consolidation of economic and cultural resources for a select few. In the United States, the way this operates is through kleptocratic capitalism, reinforcing the percentage of resources amassed by the 1% of the 1%. And it's reinforced by appealing to white supremacist Christianity. I will allow others to speak about how this operates in different parts of the world, but I see a common pattern linking these different kinds of leaders and these anti-democratic regimes. And in the US, the context I know best, and I see there is a question in the chat that I'll get to here in a minute. In the US, the context I know best, it's the white evangelicals who are the most significant support for Donald Trump and this authoritarian regime he tried to establish. White Christian evangelicals. And at the core of white Christian evangelicalism is racism. There are 2 recent books by scholars, one by Anthea Butler, African-American woman who's a professor of religious studies at Penn, Anthea Butler. And the title of the book is simply White Evangelical Racism. And her argument is the racism is not an incidental feature of the religion. It is woven into the very heart of it, back to slavery and the origins of evangelicalism in the 17th and 18th centuries. Balmer makes the same point. He's a white scholar, but racism is the chief thread underneath the religious veneer. And racism is then used to create enemies, to foster these us-them dualisms. And it's that enemy creation that drives these regimes. Putin, Orban, Trump, Modi, and all of the rest. And another factor underneath this would be the employment of social media and the role especially of Facebook. I mean, there's a lot that's coming out quite recently about how Facebook has operated, is aware of the kind of polarization that is fostering and the damage that polarization does, and yet ignoring it and continuing it and even increasing it as a way of generating profit. Polarizing societies, feeding resentment and rage through enemy creation. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and that's just setting some context for Gulen's work on dialogue. There's a question from Amrita Tripathi. Sir, can mutual consultation and religious fundamentalism coexist, which is perhaps the nature of prophetic religions, due to their emphasis on the prophetic book, which people have largely failed to decode? That's a really great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. Mutual consultation and religious fundamentalism can coexist. And yes, many of the prophetic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, do operate from a principle of scarcity. And it seems to me that emphasis on scarcity is the problem more than the nature of a revealed religion. It's that idea of scarcity that we somehow have to conflict with each other over access to the beloved or access to the divine. That's the problem. And here I'm incorporating a book or the ideas of a scholar by the name of Regina Schwartz, who wrote a book called The Curse of Cain, The Violent Legacy of Monotheism, in which she traces this ideal of scarcity as the root of much religious violence, and especially from monotheistic traditions. So thank you for your question. Amrita. I hope that was a helpful response. And you're absolutely right. People have largely failed to decode the prophetic books, and we have a lot of work to do in that regard. And Gulen's life has been spent trying to decode these books and to make them plain. That is to emphasize their peaceful, loving, and their message finally of abundance, right? That God's love is not, carefully held, but God's love is freely offered. God is merciful and gracious, as the most foundational aspects of God's being. All right. So with that context, these strongmen and authoritarian employment of religion to serve the interests of a select few, it might be helpful to back up a little bit and talk about exactly what violence is and how violence operates. I am a student of Gandhi, of course, but also of the School of Peace Studies that emphasizes a maximalist understanding of violence. That is, that understands violence as harm to or destruction of life. So not just criminal violence or physical violence, but violence also takes other forms. And I talk about what I call the violence iceberg. All right, so you have the iceberg and you only see the tip of it out of the surface of the water, but the most damaging violence is sort of below the surface, operating through hidden or indirect means. So everyone recognizes physical violence as violence: murder, rape, vandalism, and so forth, right? Physical violence, but that's the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that is legitimated force. That is ways in which societies legitimate various kinds of harm to or destruction of life in order to contain criminal physical violence, right? So we have militaries and police forces and judicial systems, all of which have legitimated force at their disposal, right? And there's a really good and important debate happening about, why do we have all of these militaries? Why do we have police forces? And I'm an advocate for having those conversations. But underneath legitimated force, there's yet another level of violence, social economic violence, that produces harm to or destruction of life, that kills people just as surely as a gunshot, only more slowly and with greater suffering over time. So social and economic violence, inequities in housing, inequities in access to food, education, inequities in access to healthcare. All of these forms of social and economic violence feed into the other forms of violence, militarism and criminal violence. But finally, at the base of the violence iceberg, that which is most fundamental to any act of violence is what I call cultural violence. And here is where we see racism, sexism, and any form of us, them, dualism, or binary thinking. Violence stems from a description of the world more than it stems from a particular action in the world. In other words, any act of violence is first rationalized at some level by a human being through their brain and through the neural pathways forged through cultural habits and practices, finally through language. So, understanding Gulen's emphasis on dialogue then is to understand how he's attempting to retrieve language from its abuse in forms of violence. And his emphasis then concentrates on this term, hoshguru, in particular, as a form of peace growing, in contrast to violence. I mean, Gulen, throughout his life, is an advocate for nonviolence, and it feeds directly into his dialogue activities. Following a Kurdish reformer, mid-20th century Kurdish reformer by the name of Said Nursi, Gulen sees, three problems in the modern world: ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence. And his entire life has been spent trying to address these three problems. Ignorance through education, learning, literacy, including through dialogue. Poverty through wealth generation, through social enterprises that serve the common good. And disunity or violence through peace growing, through nonviolent collective action and through dialogue. So Gulen's life, it's hard to kind of pull the different strands apart. Like any individual life, he's an integrated person, but he also has a very clear foundation in Islam, and then the threads kind of stem from that core. So regarding disunity or violence being solved through dialogue and tolerance, on page 244 and 5 of the book, I describe a conference that was held in Istanbul in 1995, where Gulen was the keynote speaker. It was held at the Renaissance Polat Hotel on the Sea of Marmara. It was a beautiful evening. Well over 1,000 people were attended, and journalists talked about how it was the most pluralistic gathering, the most diverse gathering of people ever brought together in the Republic of Turkey. And Gulen spoke. And he spoke about hoşgörü in particular. He said, "We have seen with our own eyes that there is no reason to fear one another, and that all people can meet with whomever they want. If we have not come together until today, it means that we have been hung up on our mistaken conjectures and neglected an important human responsibility." In other words, what Gulen here is saying is that freedom of association, the freedom to gather together across our differences, is crucial, is one of the foundational human rights. And just as an aside, living now in what some scholars have been taken to calling surveillance capitalism, where we are constantly being tracked and surveyed, the capacity and possibility of freedom of association, freedom to meet with anybody, anywhere, anytime, right, has to be asserted ever more clearly. And, speaking personally, at least, in this situation of pandemic, I think we all have felt acutely, right, the absence of those opportunities for free association with others. And so that's at the foundation of this hoşgörü, this Gulen's approach to dialogue. He went on in his keynote speech in 1995. The event was sponsored by the Journalists and Writers Foundation, one of these social enterprises, as a think tank founded in Istanbul, still exists. The foundation is known in Turkey mainly as a representative of tolerance, of hoşgörü. In fact, it has identified itself with Hoşgörü. Whenever it is mentioned, that is the Journalists and Writers Foundation, immediately after that, Hoşgörü is mentioned as well. So this principle of free association is the key or the foundational element of dialogue, and Hoşgörü, Gulen's practice of dialogue. The event was sponsored, as I mentioned, by the Journalists and Writers Foundation, one of these think tanks, one of these social enterprises begun by Gulen and people he had inspired. And said again in our context, note how authoritarian regimes try to shut down free speech, free media, and the free exercise of religions. So in Turkey, for example, people inspired by Gulen have had their businesses closed, newspapers shuttered, television stations, the assets seized. We were talking billions of dollars of assets taken and people's lives irreparably damaged as a result of this so-called Islamic regime. And you see patterns similar to that, in other places around the world as well. And so this targeting of free speech, of language, of the free association of ideas and sharing of ideas is the very hallmark of totalitarian, authoritarian regimes, even if they are legitimated through a so-called democratic process. So dialogue depends on free speech and the free exercise of religion. And here, free exercise of religion doesn't mean that the majority gets to set the terms. The free exercise of religion and religious freedom is intended to protect the expressions of minorities, right? Currently in the United States, again, the context I know best, many evangelical Christians are claiming to be victims and claiming that their religious freedom is abrogated or is somehow being damaged by LGBTQ advocacy and marriage equality. Well, that's nonsense. There is no harm done to evangelical Christians' freedom to practice their religion just because gay people can get married, right? So it's a very delicate issue, this free association and freedom of religion. It can actually be employed as a club against minorities when it was intended in its origins to protect the expressions of minorities. And that's very clearly how Gulen advocates for dialogue that lifts up the voices of those who have been silenced in the past. Because finally, back to this term Hoşgörü again, as the critical expression of Gulen's thinking. Hoşgörü is actually it's a compound Turkish word that puts two words together, to see nicely, right? And Professor Scott Alexander at Catholic Theological Union, a great Islamic scholar, and his Turkish is much better than mine, once gave a talk with me at a conference that was organized in Accra, Ghana. It was the first time that Christians, Muslims, and indigenous practitioners had ever been together for dialogue in Accra. And Scott talked about Hoşgörü and what it means. And he said, really, it's a theological term. And what Hoşgörü means is to see another as God sees them. And that means to see another with eyes of mercy and compassion, first of all, right? And that's the principle of dialogue out of which Gulen is operating, this principle of every encounter with another person is an encounter with one of the beloveds. All right, so that's part one. Part two then, advocacy for a non-binary world. Throughout his life, Gulen has actually been quite far ahead of the Hizmet movement itself, which has kind of been catching up slowly in terms of gender equality. And in his own advocacy, he has consistently spoken for equal educational opportunity for girls and boys. Women have gone on to be lawyers, judges, doctors, everything. In other words, he sees no limitations to the full fulfillment of life based on any gender differentiation. One of the interviews I did for the book was with a journalist, a woman by the name of Sevgi Akacheshme. That was her name before she's now been married. And in my interview with her, she said some really interesting things. I want to share with you some of her observations. She was the last editor of today's Zaman, which was the English-speaking version of Zaman, which was at the time the largest circulation newspaper in Turkey. Today's Zaman is gone, and Zaman is also closed by the government because of the repression of Hizmet and Gulen. So here's what I wrote based on my interview with Sevgi Akacheshme came into the Hizmet orbit through a tutoring center in Turkey, which was one of those social enterprises. So Gulen and people inspired by him set up tutoring centers to help people get through the college entrance exams, to do well on the college entrance exams. And that became a source of revenue for the movement, and then funded these schools and funded the dialogues and funded the other social enterprises as well, in a virtuous cycle of economic development. So Akacheshme came into the Hizmet orbit through a tutoring center in the mid-1990s, and she observed accurately enough that, quote, "We cannot import people from Mars or Venus and turn them into Hizmet volunteers. Given the raw material, the movement has been working a miracle." Karim Balchi, who for a time worked with Akacheshme at Zaman, confirmed that the miracle had worked in his case. Female empowerment had been, he said, a growing edge for me, he put it. But when I follow Hoja Effendi, that is one of the terms used to describe Gulen, Hoja Effendi, honored teacher, simply means, I make gender equality a principle. Akacheshme also recalled a meeting she had with Gulen that left a strong impression on her. She had just moderated a forum at the World Women's Association in New York City, sponsored by the Journalists and Writers Foundation. There's that foundation again. Following the panel, several of the women asked to meet with Hoja Effendi. Gulen then hosted 7 or 8 of them. He welcomed us with a smiling face, she recalled, and the group discussed together how the panel had gone. He encouraged such initiatives, she said. It was an open forum, so, she went on, I complained about the status of women. None of the women want to take credit for what's being accomplished, she recalled saying, so it's always men who are visible. Gulen listened to her complaint and answered sympathetically, if a bit condescendingly, saying in effect that it's not something that's going to change overnight. He then talked, she went on, about how the prophet Aisha had orchestrated and led an army. And then he said, I wish we had a female chief of staff. The woman concluded by saying, Hoja Effendi is beyond Hizmet and certainly beyond traditional Turkish society regarding the rights of women. So this advocacy for gender equality stems from his understanding of the prophet's life. And I see Pragya Narang has a question for me. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So one thing I've been wondering since you've been talking, that India, where we are like we are land of Gandhi, and even with Turkey, such I would say idealistic people like Gulen, and there's so many. What goes wrong? I mean, what can when the society is deteriorating and going back into this dualism, at what point do we say that this is the point we need to put a stop to it? And also how, like, what exactly flips with somebody who's been there? And I'm kind of really wondering about this.
Thank you for your question. I'll start with sort of the last part of it first. At what point do you say no and try to stop this, return to dualism? And I think, Gandhi would put it pretty clearly that, this is not something that you can just turn a switch on. It has to be based on a consistent and continuous life, right? And a discipline, right? A yoga, if you will, right? And certainly for Gulen, that takes it out of the realm of idealism and into the realm of practice, of everyday practice. And so what that means practically then is building coalitions, developing, richer collaborative partners who share a vision and with whom you can work. I mean, power finally is not force, is not violence. Power is, as Hannah Arendt describes, the capacity of people to act in concert. And so finally, and this is what Gandhi demonstrated, the people have the power. When people decide they want to be free, Desmond Tutu said, nothing can stop them. And so empire, in all of its manifestations, and in all of these authoritarian regimes, empire is always vulnerable to the multitudes. The problem is organizing the multitudes and keeping the multitudes from falling into these us-them dualisms, these enemy creation systems that then exploit their religiosity, their devotion, their deepest source of strength. This is what's so tragic about it, is that people's religions are exploited to do harm and violence, right? Rather than to be the sources of peace that they are for them as individuals and can be globally as well. So that's perhaps too idealistic or general an answer to your question, probably, but it's a really good question. And I kind of sense what was behind that as well. What's gone wrong in Turkey? How did things go so badly in Turkey as well? Is that part of what's behind your question?
Yes, both India and Turkey.
Yeah, I can't speak much to the Indian situation, and I would love to hear from you as our conversation continues, where you see things dovetails or where you see divergences as well, because no two situations are the same, right? I mean, they are very different. In Turkey, what clearly happened in my estimation is that, Gulen and people of Hizmet became a very convenient scapegoat for Erdogan to unite really disparate factions in Turkey. The Islamist right, so the Islamist nationalists on the one hand, and the secularist faction on the other. Two really different groups were united then in their scapegoating of Gulen and people of Hizmet. So it's, again, this enemy creation system that happens. And, Gulen and people inspired by him are perfect scapegoats because they don't hit back. Because they are committed to nonviolent action, positive action, staying true to one's principles and one's practice and playing that out. And I'll say more about this, as I get near the end of my talk, but very clearly, this is not the first time that there's been repression, that Gulen has experienced oppression in his life. It's been a consistent theme. He's been jailed repeatedly. He's, been on the run for 6 years from the Turkish government, et cetera. And every time there's been this attempt to repress, Hizmet has come back stronger. Now, this is an unprecedented situation, and it is. I mean, the repression is incredibly harsh, and it has done extraordinary damage. And yet, if we believe in the power of nonviolence and nonviolent collective action, and if we believe in our faith traditions, right, and put those into practice, they will endure, even if an individual is gone, right? This is what we see, is that consistent practice produces good fruit. And so that's the hope, and that we can be creative and flexible in building new coalitions to organize across the dualisms, the binary worlds that get created. So thank you for your question.
Sir, I would like to interrupt on the power thing, sir. If I'm audible, sir?
Sure, go ahead. And who is speaking, please?
Yeah. Sir, my name is Rajan. So there is a problem with my email. So I'm using Amrita Tripathi email. Sorry for that. My name is Rajan, basically.
Okay, go ahead.
Sir, I would like you to interrupt on the notion of power. Sir, I have three things which I would like to point out. Friedrich Nietzsche said that it is the will to power which basically motivates us to pursue something. The essence of human being is will to power. On the other hand, you referred Hannah Arendt, but I would like to quote Michel Foucault, who said that power does not have any sort of structure. And third, I would like to quote George Orwell, who said that it is power which corrupts human beings. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what would you say in these three things? That will to power is the essence of human being, and power does not have any structure, and it is the power which corrupts human beings. So this is the thing which I would like to say, sir.
Okay, great. It's a wonderful question. I agree with you that humanity has a will to power. It's also a will to live, finally is even more crucial, I think. And we share that with other living beings and with creatures. So I think more fundamental than the will to power is what Albert Schweitzer, the Nobel laureate and great musician and theologian, described as reverence for life. There is woven into the fabric of life a respect for life. And let's start there. First, with that affirmation by grounding ourselves, not just in the human world, but in the natural world, which is our home, right? So will to life is more crucial than the will to power. Foucault's right on so many things. Power has no structure. It is always an improvised phenomenon. Power is in that sense. And here is where peaceful power with rather than power over, has to stem from what the scholar Jon Pahl calls the moral imagination. Peace growing is always a matter of the moral imagination. That is, recognizing an injustice and acting to correct it, recognizing a wrong and trying to make it right. And in that sense, power is neutral. Power can be abused. Power can also be used positively. So I disagree with Orwell on the idea that power always corrupts. I think there are people, in fact, who, as power develops, exercise it faithfully and honestly, in accord with truth. Satyagraha, truth force, finally, is a kind of power that is a positive force in the world. And this is where, to anticipate a little bit more, Istishara really comes into play. This notion of mutual consultation and holding each other accountable, right? I mean, that's sort of at the very foundation of this notion of Istishara, is this mutual accountability. There's no one voice that is the final arbiter of all truth, but in fact, it is through our consultation, our deliberation, our learning, that we advance and find a better way. So I would agree. I think Orwell is brilliant at analyzing totalitarianism, and we are certainly living in an age of Orwellian big lies, right? Where falsehoods are becoming truth. So in the case of Gulen, for instance, he is, according to the Turkish government, a terrorist, which is like calling Gandhi a terrorist, or Jesus a terrorist, or the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a terrorist. It's a big lie that just gets said over and over and over and over and over again, and therefore people believe it. We are mammals. We learn by repetition. So absolute power corrupts, absolutely, yes. On that, I think Orwell is correct. But post-truth era, yes, exactly. That's a sort of cynical way to describe, this era. And I don't think it will hold, because finally we depend too much on truth and trustworthiness in our everyday lives for it to entirely crumble. But I don't know for sure. I don't have a crystal ball to sort of see where things are going. So the prophet, back to Gulen's advocacy for a non-binary world, was still in part 2 of my talk. He really did draw this notion from the Prophet Muhammad, and especially from Prophet Muhammad's advocacy beyond tribalism. And this is, where Gulen drew his work with the Kurds in particular, and advocacy for Kurdish participation in Turkish society. And these are Gulen's words. When God's messenger, upon him be peace and blessings, was raised as a prophet, the same kind of racism under the name of tribalism was prevalent in Mecca. Quraysh considered themselves in particular, and Arabs in general, superior to all the other peoples of the world. God's messenger came with the divine message and proclaimed that no Arab is superior over a non-Arab, and no white is superior over black, and superiority is by righteousness and God-fearing alone. He even declared that if an Abyssinian black Muslim were to rule over Muslims, he should be obeyed. So again, this Gulen's advocacy for a non-binary world, getting beyond these binaries of male and female, black, white, Arab, non-Arab, it's Jew, Christian, etc. Okay, Furkan Yuner has a question for me. Go ahead, Furkan.
Hello, sir. Good morning in United States.
Yes, it's pretty early.
Yeah, I'm also from Turkey and I live in Slovenia. And I was already reading Fethullah Gulen's books when I was even in a high school. And I mean, since I know him, he was always peace builder in Turkey, also in the world after United States, his United States time. And also he opened intercultural, interreligious dialogue centers all over the world. And he opened the schools in the eastern part of Turkey to actually educate the people. Like you said, this is one of the biggest problems and we have to educate. And also he did a lot of things to actually donate money to the students to get them educated. And I also personally follow your works. And I think you are one of the few professors in the Western world who can understand him clearly. And thank you for that and your speech and the books to make him more understandable. But I see, like you already mentioned, like now Turkish government see Fethullah Gulen and his students as a terrorists. And like you said, I don't call anyone dictator, but it's kind of system of the Turkey now. Dictators, they don't like the dialogue because like you said, whenever the dialogue actually happens between nations, between cultures, between religions, actually this cuts their works. And I also personally see like abusement of the political power in Turkey and also in other Islamic countries to actually make the people unaware of what's happening, like what Quran says, what we should do, and other things. And what is my question? You, as a professor in the Western world, and understood clearly what Gulen says, and also other maybe Islamic scholars, and you have been in Turkey as well, and you know how Turkish people are like very good against the foreigners, like in their country. And what do you see in the future of Turkey? Like, if Gulen can see Turkey as a peaceful place in his life, or if the people can understand his dialogue perspectives soon. This is my question.
Yeah, well, one of the books I'm working on right now, I have two that are underway. One is on siblinghood, sisterhood and brotherhood, and literature and across religious traditions. I think it's important that we understand ourselves as, living in a community of kin where we are all sisters and brothers. But the other book is entitled A Coming Religious Peace. And it focuses on the emergence of religious peace building, or what I call peace growing, because I think it's organic. I don't think peace is built like a building is built. It's grown. It's an organic process. And like other organic processes, it can't be stopped. We depend upon peaceful interactions with each other as the norm in our daily life. And our religious traditions all bring us peace. That's why they've endured for millennia, right? You know, you look at a nation state, the Republic of Turkey, 1923. Okay, it's not even a century old. Whereas Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, they've been around for millennia, and with reason, because finally, our religious traditions are ways to develop neural pathways, right, that foster cooperation, that enable us to utilize language, words, rather than weapons. And it's that development that can't be stopped, right? And why I finally have hope for Turkey and for India and for Hungary and even for the United States. Although, as Dr. King put it, you know, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. No question. Our military is, you know, absolutely awful in that regard and not an example for the rest of humanity to follow. So I have to speak first of all to, you know, the violence in the United States before we start talking about what's happening in Turkey or in Russia or anywhere else. I don't believe that Mr. Gulen will see a return to Hizmet to Turkey in his lifetime. I think that well is too poisoned right now. Even in the absence of Erdogan, I expect Turkey will, for the foreseeable future at least, be an inhospitable place for Hizmet, unfortunately. I can pray for an alternative, for a collapse of that regime and a return to something resembling, you know, a robust democratic republic. But I'm not hopeful in the short term, at least, about Turkey. But I pray that the hospitality of the Turkish people, the hoşgörü, is still simmering kind of underneath the surface of this authoritarian, repressive regime. So that's the best I can do, although I will say a little bit more about why there's reason for hope near the end of my talk, if that's okay. I hope that answers your question for time, and thank you very much for sharing it with me.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you're welcome. Next passage I want to share is from Gulen, again, about this advocacy for a non-binary world, and really an affirmation of our common humanity. And this is Gulen writing about the Kurds and the Kurdish situation in Turkey. And he's really writing in many ways, you know, to the Kurds, but also to Turks. And here's what he says. We have the same faith. We believe in the same God. Our food comes from the same ultimate sustainer. We live on the same soil and others under the same sun. We breathe the same air. We have the same religion, the same destiny, and the same history. As Turks and Kurds, we are everywhere in Turkey. We have spread all over the country together. In a rapidly globalizing world of revolutionary advancements in transportation and communication, and in a world that is evolving into a great village, European countries that fought endless wars in the past have gotten together and even seek political unity. That is how the world is. And we know that we were born as Turks and Kurds regardless of our personal wishes. Given the fact that it is not in our hands to become a Turk or a Kurd, isn't it absurd to discriminate against people based on their Turkish or Kurdish identity or the language they speak? Isn't it to the detriment of all of us, right? So these binaries, these, you know, us versus them dualisms that create enemies harm all of us, harm the one who is the perpetrator too, right? By forestalling or short-circuiting the possibilities of cooperation. And just as an aside, the most important issue facing humanity right now is the climate crisis. And the only way we are going to solve that climate crisis is if our religious traditions speak up and hold governments accountable to advance green energy, sustainable energy that reduces the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere. All right. And let me just put that out there as something we can talk about in a little bit. So, advocacy for a non-binary world means overcoming all of these dualisms. In one of the interviews I did with Mr. Gulen, I had a chance to sit down with him after I had a complete manuscript done. I did not want to talk with him at the outset of the research. I wanted to wait until I had a complete narrative line so that I could ask him very specific and focused questions. I asked him about LGBTQ inclusion, marriage equality, and so forth. And he was, to my surprise, a little bit as accepting as he was about any gender or identity markers. For Gulen, finally, it's relationship to the beloved that matters, not one's sex or race or gender identity. And the beloved is, as the Bismillah makes plain, the most merciful, the most compassionate. And that is the pattern of practice that can get us beyond this enemy creation, these binaries, these us-them dualisms. All right, final section of my talk, and then I'll take questions and we can have a conversation as long as your interest remains up until 10 and my time. And then I will be taking my son and daughter-in-law who have been here with us for a few days. We celebrated my father's 90th birthday on Saturday. It was such a joy. He was so happy. We had about 40 people here at our home. It was a lovely day. It was just beautiful. And, both of my brothers were there and all of my kids. I have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and they were all there. It was just a joy. And so today I take my son and daughter-in-law back to the airport. They live in Alaska. And so they'll be flying home to Alaska, and I drive them down to the airport. All right. Collective nonviolent action, working in the peace-growing garden. Then, as I mentioned, I don't think peace is something we build. I think peace is something we grow. I'm a gardener. I love, having a garden. I grow potatoes and tomatoes and peppers and lettuces and just all kinds of stuff. And I love gardening as a process and as a way to understand peace, how peace is brought about. In the same way that violence I describe as, having 3 components, I think peace is the same way. And in the peace growing garden, there are 3 different kinds of peace that we have to be aware of, or 3 different processes connected to building growing peace that we must be aware of. So there's what I call basic peace, first of all, which is a society where people have a voice. And this is actually the least, or the most foundational, but also the simplest. So this is what peace theorists call negative peace, the absence of war, the absence of violence, where people's voices are heard and recognized. This is like the flower in a garden, or the potato or the tomato, the fruit. I mean, finally, it's the last, right? And the very sort of tip of what goes on in peace growing. A second kind of peace is what I call policy peace. So basic peace is voice, right? Where people's voices are heard and recognized, and where there is not force or violence quashing their voices. Policy peace then is justice, is equity. And policy peace would be similar to, pulling weeds, and making sure that the plants are carefully tended, so that they're capable of growing well, flourishing, right? Policy piece would be all of those practices and social policies that produce more equitable access to housing, food, education, healthcare, right? All of that is a way of fostering the capacity to flourish, which is all that peace is or means. It's nothing utopian. It is simply the capacity to flourish. That's what peace is. So voice, justice, basic peace, policy peace. But then there's what I call deep peace. And this is working in the soil. This is getting to the roots. This is where the radical stuff happens. And it's where our religions live. Because deep peace is trust, right? Deep peace is the capacity to trust that the person you're speaking with is telling you the truth. And deep peace is what our religious traditions foster. This is why, again, they have endured for millennia, because they provide people this sense that even though we are fragile, finite human beings, our life matters. And so this deep peace is what Gulen has sought to cultivate throughout his life. And as I described it, there are 5 seeds of deep peace, 5 different modes of behaving that produce this trust that's so crucial to every society, every human relationship finally. And those 5 seeds are the 5 organizing principles of my book. There are 5 chapters, and they focus on different aspects of Gulen's life, but also different ways the Hizmet movement contributes to growing peace. And those 5 seeds of peace are, first, literacy, learning. And Gulen talks a lot about scientific learning in particular, holding the scientific and the spiritual together. The metaphor is you have to fly with 2 wings. And you can't see me real well, but if a bird, both wings have to operate in order to fly. So holding together scientific and spiritual literacy and learning is the first seed of deep peace. Second, this just makes sense. Peace is fostered, capacity to flourish is fostered through peaceful practices, such as the 5 pillars of Islam: confession, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, sharing of material resources, zakat. But Gulen, and those are the 5 that are most important to him because he is a Muslim, but he also recognizes the utility, the strength of spiritual practices is found in other traditions, right? All of our religious traditions engage us with stories, say the Bhagavad Gita, right? An amazing story about nonviolence. Gandhi's interpretation of it is just brilliant, right? Is that this, the struggle takes place in the field of, one's life. The struggle with the ego, right? The struggle with the attempt to control. And so our religious traditions are all built around these stories, these myths, and these practices, these rituals that build a community of kin and that bring us deep peace through non-violent means, right? Prayer is inherently non-violent. And the same is true of pilgrimage and of fasting. All of these are disciplines that promote flourishing for individuals and that build communities as well, as has been proven again over millennia, over the durability of our religious and spiritual practices. Third seed of deep peace is what I call engaged empathy. Human beings are born with an abhorrence of suffering and an abhorrence of the suffering of others, unless one is sociopathic. When you see someone else suffering, you feel suffering with them too. There is that empathy. And Gulen writes a lot about this awareness of suffering, and he himself feels the suffering of others acutely. He cries all the time. So he was actually known as the crying Hoca, or the crying teacher in Turkey, because he would break into tears in the middle of his sermons because of his acute awareness and feeling for the suffering of others. But empathy alone does not change things. Empathy engaged does. That is, when people are aware of the suffering of others and then act to do something about it, that's when the world changes. That's when peace is fostered. When someone like Lima Bowie, the Liberian Nobel Peace Laureate, when she, as a single mother, saw her child suffering, she decided to take action and become a peace grower. And it wound up, it's an amazing story. If you're not familiar with her work, Lima Bowie, Gbowee, Gbowee, Lima Bowie, her memoir, Mighty Be Our Powers, How Prayer, Sex, and Sisterhood Saved a Nation at War, documents that it was through prayer and through getting women together where they had a voice, they told each other their stories, and then they prayed and they chanted and they marched and they protested and they ended the Civil War, forged a new constitution for Liberia, led to the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as the first female president of an African nation, right? Engaged empathy, right? Recognizing the suffering of others and doing something about it. So that's third seed of deep peace. Fourth, you've heard this phrase before, principled pluralism. That is recognition of difference, and yet a commitment to one's own practice. Principled pluralism is the fourth seed of deep peace. And the fifth is social enterprise. That is a way of doing business that focuses not just on the quarterly profits of shareholders, but that focuses on people and the planet along with profits. And that's what a social enterprise is. And here, the Gulen enterprises and businesses have been much like what Muhammad Yunus put forth in his work on creating a world without poverty as the goal of social business. So I'll wrap up and then turn to questions. We need new coalitions, and especially coalitions across religious lines, to counter the concentration of resources in the hands of non-democratic, authoritarian, and so-called religious leaders. Interreligious engagement is the most difficult but most durable path to enduring peace. If you're not familiar with Immanuel Kant's essay on perpetual peace from 1793, I encourage you to check it out. It's a remarkable piece of philosophy and a remarkably visionary work, Immanuel Kant. It's Essay on Perpetual Peace. You can find it online. In that essay, Kant envisions the three facets that will bring enduring peace. The first is the existence of a collective community where people have a voice. Usually a nation, state, some kind of organized, Hobbes used the word Leviathan, that has a monopoly on violence and that keeps, tribal violence from rising to the point of harm to others. So first, nation or state where people have a voice. Second, Kant says trade. Nations, peoples who trade with each other don't kill each other, because if you kill your trading partner, it tends to be bad for trade, right? There's a certain logic to it that just makes sense. The adage is, and this is Tom Friedman, no two nations with a McDonald's in them have ever gone to war with each other. It's not quite true, but it's close, right? So there's, and don't get me wrong, I think McDonald's is terrible food. Don't eat it. But the Kroc family who started McDonald's actually has set up probably the premier peace studies programs in the United States right now. So all of those Big Macs finally did some good in the world. But second, then, so there's that trade, this equitable exchange, this reciprocal exchange of goods and commerce builds enduring peace. And the third is what's most important. Kant says, people who peoples who participate in international organizations and collaborations, like you didn't know this, but like the United Nations, World Bank, and so forth. These international organizations, that will also foster peace, because then people will know each other rather than fear each other. And what is amazing is that most peace and justice scholars don't recognize that the most durable of our international organizations are our religious traditions, right? Nation states, United States, 1776, big deal. India, what, 1938? I mean, these are, historically speaking, a blip compared to the millennia of existence and the kinds of cooperation that our religious traditions have fostered. Interreligious cooperation is barely a century old. It dates back basically to the founding of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1914, coming out of World War I. So all of this dialogue and this international peace growing on a religious foundation is a new thing in the world, relatively. And yet we have to accelerate our capacity to cooperate in order to deal with this rise of authoritarianism, and on the one hand, built on us-them dualisms, rise of authoritarianism, and to deal with the climate crisis that is facing us all and threatens all life. So Gulen's emphasis then on istishara, this mutual consultation, builds trust. It's necessary in the face of persecution. Gulen has faced accusations repeatedly throughout his life, and yet he has remained patient and building on positive action, this muspet harakat, and this mutual consultation and accountability. And out of that, persecution each time previously Hizmet has grown stronger. From my perspective as a Christian, and I am a practicing Christian, I see this very much as a story of death and resurrection. From my perspective as a historian of religions, I see Gulen's life and the Hizmet story as a story of resilience, and how religious trust and love, finally, is more powerful than violence and force. And Gulen's dialogue, advocacy, and collective positive action rooted in Islam invites us all to hope. And so I'm going to read for you the way I end the book then, which takes up the question of, what's going to happen when Gulen dies. He was born in 1938, so is not a young man anymore. And here's what I write. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of his biography. And by now, there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, in fact, as Gulen wrote in a poem written while in America, his eyes again on a very long horizon, and he tied them to no specific nation. And now this is a long quote from Fethullah Gulen. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. The springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God Those devotees of love who have no time for hostility will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. And I have two more paragraphs to conclude the book, and then I'll wrap up there and we can have some conversation. In a winter of brutal strong men, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed no better than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fethullah Gulen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that, quote, difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fethullah Gulen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gulen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korajuk was now a frail, old man. And yet Fethullah Gulen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believes in heaven, he believes in resurrection, he believes in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gulen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They also were convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gulen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. So the end of Fethullah Gulen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gulen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Okay, I hope there was value in the words that I shared with you from my book, Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet. I would be delighted if you have some comments, questions, concerns for me at this point for our time together. We have about a half an hour. Okay, I saw Sakshivats first, please, and then Unias.
Am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah. Good evening, sir, from India. Sir, I just had a question. So we have been discussing some very important words like peace, violence, unity, cultural acceptance, economic imbalance, freedom of association, togetherness, dialogue, especially dialogue. But the common thing which I can grasp from all this is that it's all connected to the one word that is called religion. You know, it's all connected to the core of the word religion. So in itself, what I can find out from this is that religion in itself is an umbrella which connects and collects almost everything of the human society and the practices. As in the session also, we have discussed about of the system of deep peace, in which the trust is inbuilt, and it has also been said that it is in this section only that religion is a key which fosters the policy, or which fosters the principle of deep peace. So with that said, and with the quote of Hash Baru, please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, which is also based on the fundamentals of to see other as God sees them. So when everything is centered to the word religion, where do we put the people who are not practicing religion? Where would we put atheism into it, or the atheist people into it? And with that said, religion has, in a sense, the practice of religion or the radicalism of religion has also fostered violence and radicalism into it, but it has also developed peace also. The peace, the word religion has been, it's have a pros and a con also. So where do the atheists or the atheism can find these two functions, or where can they find the base to foster peace into their society? And so the crux of my question is, what is your view on atheism, and how do you think it can help to construct a society? Will it be harmful? That's it, sir.
Oops, I'm muted. It's a great question. Thank you very much for it, Sakshi. And I'm going to recommend that you find a copy of one of my books. The most recent book prior to the Gulen book is entitled Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. And in that book, I define what I mean by religion. And, I studied at the University of Chicago, and pretty much the prevailing attitude at the University of Chicago is that everybody has a religion. In other words, atheism is also a religious commitment. Some of the atheists I know are the most religious people I know, if you understand what I mean. That is, everyone has some sense of an ultimate commitment. Everyone's life is organized around some kind of projection of transcendent authority that helps them make their way through the chaos of everyday experience, right? And so being able to identify those religious patterns and practices, not necessarily associated with historic religious traditions, is particularly crucial and important. In the book Empire of Sacrifice, I take up in particular how civil religion is a problem. So, it was Rousseau who coined the idea of a civil religion, that every nation has to have some kind of religious foundation in order to endure, right? And that this civil religion, right, can function for good or for ill. And I think we need to be attentive to these kind of hybrid manifestations of religiosity. In the United States, as I mentioned, it's a combination of white evangelical Christianity with, U.S. nationalism that is the real problem. In India, as I understand it, it's sort of Hindu nationalism associated with the current political regime and its rising economic power. That is the problem, especially for Muslims, right? And so when we see these common patterns, right, we recognize that we need stronger coalitions of people who are committed to just civil societies. And that means everybody, atheists, agnostics, people who would claim no religious tradition whatsoever, are all have a place at the table, and necessarily so. This is what principled pluralism means, right? It's not a relativism where everybody is, reduced to the least common denominator. It's more a robust recognition that we are stronger when our differences are at the foreground, right? And here, the book I recommend is by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Title of the book is The Dignity of Difference: How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, written from his perspective as an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, but arguing for robust interreligious engagement, dialogue, in order to avoid the abuse of religion for violent purposes, which you're absolutely right, Sakshi, has been a crucial problem in recent, in all of history, right? Religions can be manipulated and exploited by tyrants. Okay, I think Eunice was next, please. And I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
Okay, it's so nice, sir. Okay, thank you, sir, for your wonderful session. So my question is about actually Erdogan and I believe from 2002 to 2013, Erdogan's party, AKP party, and the Fethullah Gulen, like both were in collaboration. And I think like after the Ergenekon investigation or like some controversies was there actually. I don't know like actually what the details about these controversies and some political allegations against Erdogan's party and some corruption controversies also. So like after this, actually Erdogan started targeting the Gulen's movement and journalists and many activists were arrested. So like my question is actually what actually is this Aragonacon investigation, and is this thing has anything to do with the future of Gulen movement and the political changes in Turkey happened after 2014 or 15, and like the political involvement of Gulen's movement in Turkish political system. Like Erdogan was actually trying to target the Gulen movement. He frightened that it will be like a threat to his political regime, this Islamist regime. Is that a cause? Actually, that's my second question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a good one, and I'll refer you to my book on Fethullah Gulen, where I describe in the last chapter, in particular, I go into great detail about what happened in Ergenekon and the corruption inquiry, and how things fell apart. Were there individuals inspired by Gulen who collaborated with the AKP? Yes, absolutely there were. Did Gulen encourage that kind of political association? No. He has never endorsed a candidate. He's never sided with a party. And he certainly was no big fan of Erdogan. If you read what he has said about him publicly, he was suspicious of him right from the start because of the way he was engaging Islam in political life, right? Over and against the tenets of the secular Republic of Turkey. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds here of the details of Ergenekon and, whether Gulen and people, judges inspired by him were part of that. But clearly, Ergenekon defanged the Turkish military as the source of the sort of secular foundations for Turkey. And that then paved the way for Erdogan to, again, manipulate Islam into developing and strengthening his own power base. And that power base was essentially kleptocratic, is essentially kleptocratic. That is, it's making a very few people very, very rich in Turkey. And what happened following 2013 was that some individuals in the judiciary and the police recognized this corruption, this kleptocracy operating, and tried to expose it. For exposing the crime, they were labeled criminals. And that is really when the break, if you want to describe it in those terms, between Hizmet and the AKP was finalized. And then Gulen and people associated with him increasingly became scapegoats for any problem that was happening in Turkey, right? Including the so-called failed coup of July 15, 2016. And again, from my perspective, nobody knows what exactly happened in that event. We don't have access to the documents yet in that failed coup of 2016. Were there individuals inspired by Gulen who may have participated? Possibly. There were individuals inspired by him in the military. They were serving, with integrity. But was this somehow orchestrated by Gulen? I cannot believe that would be the case, given everything I know about him and his life and work. It would be a complete contradiction, a violation of everything he's preached and taught about for 60 years. So the language that often gets used about Hizmet and the AKP is that Hizmet people of Hizmet infiltrated political life, serving in the judiciary and the police force and the military. Well, people inspired by Gulen got educations, and then they served all over Turkish society, not just in the military, the police, and the judiciary. So they infiltrated baklava baking. They infiltrated construction trades. They infiltrated education. They infiltrated the media. Just the language we use, we have to be very careful. And journalists are particularly bad about this. They pick up this language all the time. The fact of the matter is, people inspired by Gulen were active in civil society and were acting with integrity. And for doing so, because they were emphasizing free speech, dialogue, collaboration, cooperation, they were a threat. They were perceived as a threat by Erdogan and his authoritarian ambitions. And again, this is why Gulen and people of Hizmet were scapegoated, became the enemy against which Erdogan could organize his puppet regime. I hope that's a helpful response to your question, but really, read the last chapter of my book, and I describe it in much greater detail. All right, Pragya in the ranks, again, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to...
Can I, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Praya?
It's Pragya, like Prague, the city, and yeah. So, so I'm going back to your quote that, peace isn't something we build, and it is something we grow. So, and taking the example of my own peace practice, which is I work for citizen-to-citizen peace between India and Pakistan. So I kind of want to ask, so all my life I have been focusing, not all my life, but like a short 5 years that I've been into this, I've been focusing more on the low-hanging fruit, which is people who are sitting on the fence, so it's easier to turn them. And we've been focusing, and we've always believed that at 30% people who are always going to be sort of extremists, and about 5 to 7 who are going to be idealistic peace builders, and the rest are all sitting on the fence. So that's the numbers that scientists tell us. And so if you focus on them, then basically the society stays stable. But after listening to you, I'm kind of questioning myself that maybe there are some people also in my peace building circles who kind of work on the radicalization, who work on the roots more. So I just want to kind of know your opinion that, what is more, I don't know, effective. It's kind of like I'm just kind of introspecting now, and I just want to kind of know your views on this part. Where should we hit? Where should we make the dent?
Well, terrible metaphor, first of all. What should we hit first, right? But I get it. Where should we plant? Where should we grow? What soil should we work in? Both. Both the 30% who we think will never be converted. I mean, finally, those are the ones that are most important to convert. So, and the low-hanging fruit. It's not one or the other. It has to be both simultaneously. That is, there has to be the grassroots organizing of the 65% of the multitudes. Finally, and here, temples, churches, mosques, any place where there are people gathering. Can be really effective sites for those kind of conversions to peace growing. This is what Lima Bowie did. If you watch the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it was Abigail Disney who did this film on Lima Bowie's life. Her peace growing started at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Monrovia, where she spoke about the need for peace, about, we want to end this civil war, and, we want peace. And Lima Bowie said, I'm going to organize the Christian women of Liberia to end this. And there happened to be at that gathering a Muslim police sergeant who was on duty at the time. Asatu Ba Kenneth was her name. And she heard Lima Bowie's speech, and she was so moved by it. She then went up to the microphone and said, you organize the Christian women, I will organize the Muslim women, and then we will get the Muslim and the Christian women together for peace. And that's what happened. It started in a church. And then they took that grassroots to the highest levels of government, right? And advocated for what they wanted in a way where their voice could not be denied and had to be heard. And it seems to me that pattern is great. If you're not familiar with her life and work, Pragya, I'd really recommend you check out Lima Bowie, Mighty Be Our Powers. It's a great example of the both and approach to peace growing, both the low-hanging fruit of the multitudes and women in particular, gathering the women to pray for peace, with the sort of policy level activism and engagement of, they brought together the warlords with the government of Charles Taylor to negotiate a peace. So, all right, I hope that's helpful to you. It just means more work, of course, for you, and I applaud the work that you're doing. The title of could you type the title of the agency and maybe your webpage in the chat so I can follow up on your work? I'd be interested to know more of what you're doing. And George, Arakia George, please.
Yes. Sir, I appreciate your reflection on advocacy for a non-binary world. It's really interesting, but I question myself on the possibility or actuality of a non-binary world, because we live in a biased, dualistic mentality of white, black, rich, poor, able, disabled. So how can we really actualize this non-binary world? That's my first question. If so, on what basis are we going to build this non-binary world? Thank you.
It's a great question, and the simplest answer I can give you is I don't know whether it can be built or not, because you're absolutely right. Dualisms are woven into the fabric of human history, right? Enemy creation is a great way to organize people into, massive movements. Even wars are generated out of this notion. But one of the books I have recommended to many people, and it's still worth reading, even though the author himself has kind of gone off the rails in recent years, is a book by a guy by the name of Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard neuropsychiatrist, and the title of his book is The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. And the argument of the book is basically, if you look at interstate warfare, that is, sort of classical warfare, World War I, World War II, things like that, over the last 50 to 100 years or so, the number of people who've been killed in that kind of warfare has declined precipitously. And the same is true of murder rates and other kinds of violent crime, dropped dramatically. Along with the fact that life expectancy has gone up in almost every culture. Creature comforts have gone up in almost every culture. And so Pinker's argument is that, we really, if we have eyes to see this peace that is out there, we can then begin to affirm it, recognize it, and strengthen those mechanisms that have generated it. Now, for Pinker, it's the Enlightenment that gave us this peace. And I think he's simply wrong on that. I think it is, in fact, our religious traditions, when they are not engaged in complicity with various systems of violence or force, it is our religious traditions that have generated this peace, as we have learned to understand our neighbors across religious lines. That is, as we have engaged pluralism, we have discovered, that Muslims aren't my enemy, Hindus aren't my enemy, Jews aren't my enemy. In fact, we share a lot and we can work together on all kinds of interesting things. So that's the book I'm working on next, The Coming Religious Peace, which identifies how religions over the last century or so have learned to cooperate in ways that are really pretty stunning once you pay attention to them. And Gandhi was really at the forefront of this, building on the work of Tolstoy and others. So that example is an absolutely crucial example. And Fethullah Gulen is very much in that tradition, as I see in the Gandhian tradition of nonviolence. I appreciate your question, and the simplest answer is I don't know if we can, get to a non-binary world, but I'm working on it. Behzad?
There's a question in the chat box too.
Sir, if I'm allowed to say something, sir. Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple questions in the chat box.
Rajan.
Yeah, sir.
Please click on raise hand before asking.
Hey, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry, sir.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sir, you mentioned Steven Pinker, and he highlighted that how enlightenment has incorporated in the idea of peace. I'm much follower of his approach. Sir, the way you talk about the idea of moral progress, which Steven Pinker proposes, in a similar manner, in quite contrasting manner, John Arthur Glover proposes that there is no idea of moral progress. He writes Humanity, history of 20th century, moral history of 20th century, in which he proposes that there is no notion of moral progress at all. We have seen in the Afghanistan how we were talking about the modernity, progress, and so on, and how all of a sudden this whole thing flipped aside, and we didn't say even a single thing. So, what would you say that there is any notion of moral progress at all? You also ended up with the notion that we all seek that the arc must be bent towards the justice. So I do not think that there is any notion of that arc will bend towards the justice. Throughout the history, we have seen that earlier it was the distinction of racism. Then we come to the Dark Ages. Then we come to the last century. We have seen how World War have dominated throughout the century. Now we have already laughed on the notion of truth world. So I would like to know that how, in which age we basically lived the truth. Which age was perfect? Was that the Dark Ages? Was that the racism, or is it the post-truth world? So what would you say on that?
Oh, that's a great question. I do believe that we have made moral progress that, in fact, accords with the kind of physical and technological and scientific progress that has occurred. While at the same time, we have also progressed culturally to realize beauty and goodness and truth in each other. So I don't believe we live in a post-truth world. I believe truth is under siege, including by sort of some Enlightenment spin-offs that have sort of radicalized scientific materialism, I guess would be one way to describe it, in a way that disvalues or undervalues our historic religious traditions. There is no utopia. I'm not imagining a utopia. Of course, the world is red with tooth and claw. Humans have an incredible propensity for violence. As a Christian, I believe in the doctrine of original sin, which Reinhold Niebuhr, a great 20th century American Christian theologian, said, original sin, this idea that every human being is capable of the worst, right? Each of us has within us a self-interested ego that can produce harm, right? That doctrine, Niebuhr says, is the one empirically verifiable doctrine in Christianity. Because if you look around, if you look at history, right? I mean, it is awful, no question about it. So we're not talking about utopia here. We're talking about enhancing the capacity of people to flourish. And I think Pinker is onto something in recognizing that for more people around the globe than ever before, there is a capacity to realize one's potential, one's flourishing in ways that are pretty unprecedented historically. And I want to see that grow. And that, to me, is all peace means. All right, to the chat box. And I see Rakibul Karim has a question. So Ravi, Can it be said that the idea of peace and prosperity, which has guided us after the 2 world wars, is in decline, and that religious structural violence are at the front seat? Clearly, the kind of global notion of peace and prosperity after the 2 world wars associated with the United Nations and similar agencies is under threat, right, by a resurgent religious nationalism in many contexts. But I believe that resurgent religious nationalism is backlash. That is, it is a reaction to the emergence of whatever it is that's emerging, this new world order. I don't want to put it in such terms because that sounds really Orwellian, but this capacity that we have to collaborate and cooperate, not on a neoliberal foundation, but on a different foundation. That is a foundation of collaboration, cooperative, the Commonwealth, where people and the planet are valued. So I believe this idea of peace and prosperity is under threat, but not in decline, because again, structurally, right, the relationships are in place that the religious structural violence and authoritarian violence can interrupt, but cannot finally stop as I see it, because the trust finally is crucial to living together. And unless we envision totally apocalyptic scenario in which civilization crumbles completely, which, in a place like Afghanistan, I can understand why you can see it might. But on a global scale, unless we envision such an apocalyptic scenario, it seems to me that the kind of peace and prosperity guiding us after the 2 world wars is likely to endure. Again, if we can address climate change, and as we come out of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic has been really devastating in so many ways to us, and is also a challenge to peace and reinforces in many ways the kind of attempt to grab onto something like a religion to secure one's identity and place. Okay, one more question, and then I've got to get on the road with my son and daughter-in-law. And thank you, Pragya, for sending me the information. Could you send me that in an email too? You were writing a book on human stories in India and Pakistan. That's awesome. All right, and I don't know the Pollination Project. So could you please send that to me in an email to that information? I'd love to be able to follow up in that way, because I'll lose it otherwise. Okay, Rocky Bull, last question, please.
Thank you, sir. So my question was like, we have talked about the religious aspects and peace. So what I actually feel like none of the religion actually teach for violation or discrimination, but it is the human ego actually, and the personal interest or sometimes the collective interest that deviate them from serving the core purpose or the essence of the purpose. So the quality human being is actually in crisis. So when you talk about peace, what I feel like, first of all, we need to emphasize on the quality human being, how we can actually improve the quality of our people, how we can actually work on this one. That is number one question. And so the traditional way, or yes, the education system, everything, we are just educating ourselves, but I don't think that's bring the quality of actually human being that we need to bring peace in our society or in the entire world. So what would be actually what would be the actually strategy, or what would be the initiative actually from our end or from the end of the institution who can actually bring that and who can actually meet that purpose? That's number one. And number two, sir, may I ask another question?
Yeah, I guess so. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So second question is, sir, as a human being, we all live in peace. We all live in peace, no matter which religion we belongs to. But the problem again we face when religion has a collective purpose, and to flourish with the collective purpose, in many cases, the religious people, they adopt the help, or I should say the shelter of the politics. But in politics and political people, they always have their own interest, no matter how much you are engaged or affiliated. So how long you remain with them, you remain as a white people, so you remain as a friend. But whenever you raise your voice, you become their enemy, or somehow the entire institution actually become affected by them. So do you think that the political, the religious people can become much bigger without any engagement of politics? Or is there any other way?
No, okay, those are two great questions. Regarding the ego, absolutely. Focusing on one's internal peace and one's closest relations as a source of peace is absolutely vital. Gulen talks often about the greater jihad in Islam. Jihad, that term, holy war, has been thrown around a lot, and terrorists have been called jihadis and so forth. But for Gulen, and in keeping with the mainstream of Islam, the greater jihad is the battle against the ego, right? Is the attempt internally to recognize one's drives, one's will to power, if you want to put it in those terms, and seek through practice, through prayer, through pilgrimage, through fasting, and so forth, to tame the ego and turn it towards benevolent practices and purposes, towards collective action. I don't believe collective action is inherently immoral, or that power, again, is inherently corrupting. I think we can see lots of examples of the positive uses of power through policies that support the commonweal and the common good. I think of healthcare, access to healthcare, participation in healthcare, education, agriculture. All of these contribute to peace growing and require collective engagement. And our religious traditions have historically been co-opted by narrow political interests. And it seems to me affirming instead the collaborative capacity of our religious traditions rather than the enemy creating capacities of our religious traditions is the crucial task before us moving forward. So, there's a lot of reforming that has to go on, and Gulen clearly takes his place as a reformer of Islam, someone who is seeking to restore it to its original intention and free people from the kinds of binaries that keep us set against each other rather than working together. All right. On that note, I really do have to get on the road and take my son and daughter-in-law to the airport in Milwaukee, which is about a 2-hour drive, but it's a beautiful sunny day here in Wisconsin, where I live. I hope through our time together, some light and sun has made its way to you as well. And I would look forward to hearing from you if you do have any questions that kind of linger. I sent you my email address in the first of the chat. Let me type it in one more time here so that if you do have a question, you can send it to me and I will respond. Again, I hope it was of value. Thank you, Bazad, for organizing this, and inshallah, God willing, we will all meet face-to-face in person someday.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Jon Pahl, for joining us and for your time. We come to the end of this very beautiful session, and thank you for presenting so beautifully the life and legacy of Fethullah Gulen. And I'm sure everybody will join me in congratulating your father. A happy birthday, and may we all wish that he live a long and happy life. And
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And happy Diwali to you all in advance. So we won't have any session next week. Let me congratulate you.
Happy Diwali. Yes, yeah. I hear it's a wonderful festival. Hope I can participate someday. God willing. Right. Okay. Bye-bye.